Okay, so if you're into philosophy, like really into it, you've probably spent some time thinking about the foundations of different fields, right?
Totally, like the axioms of math or, the theoretical frameworks of physics.
Exactly. But have you ever, turned that same hardcore philosophical lens onto ecology?
That's interesting because it does seem like kind of a jump from like super abstract principles to the really messy world of, living things and stuff.
Yeah, totally. But honestly, ecology as a science has been getting more recognition lately, not just for its own sake, but also for the, unique intellectual challenges it throws at us about science itself.
That's a really cool point to start from, and it's exactly where our deep dive is going to go today. We're diving into the philosophy at the heart of ecology.
Awesome.
And our main guide for this is going to be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on, well, philosophy of ecology.
Makes sense. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, that's like the gold standard for,
Yeah.
really thorough deep dives into these complex topics.
Exactly. So think of this as a super curated journey through all the big conceptual issues in ecology. And we're going to be doing it with your philosophical mind in mind.
Right.
So we're not just going to list a bunch of ecological facts. We're going deeper, looking at the frameworks behind those facts, the puzzles ecologists are trying to solve, and the big debates that are actually relevant to philosophy.
Love that.
We want you to walk away with a crystal clear, rock solid understanding of the philosophical discussions that are shaping this whole field of ecology.
Okay, that sounds amazing. So where do we even begin with all of this?
First things first, we got to get a handle on what ecology actually is. I mean, yeah, we all have some idea, but what's the, philosophically interesting way to think about it?
I'm ready.
Okay, so the word ecology itself, did you know it was coined by this guy, Ernst Haeckel?
I don't think so.
Yeah, and he wanted to use it to describe the science of what Darwin called, the struggle for existence. Darwin saw this constant competition for resources and, interaction with the environment as the core mechanism behind natural selection.
Okay, yeah, that rings a bell.
So initially, studying this struggle was basically tied up with evolutionary biology. They were like two sides of the same coin.
Makes sense.
But as time went on, they sort of went their separate ways. Evolutionary biology got really focused on the results of this struggle, so, how organisms change over many, many generations.
Okay, yeah, I see that.
But ecology zeroed in on the struggle itself, the whole crazy web of interactions between organisms and everything around them, both living and non-living.
Fascinating. So ecology is all about the dynamics of those relationships, like how living things are constantly interacting with their environment. You mentioned earlier that ecology, as a discipline, has had its own kind of struggles. What were some of the intellectual challenges it had to overcome to really establish itself?
What's super interesting from a philosophical point of view is how the sheer complexity of these ecological systems has created a whole set of really foundational problems for ecologists. These systems are crazy complicated, right? Tons of species, all these abiotic factors, everything interacting all the time.
Yeah, definitely not simple.
And this leads to some real head scratchers for scientists trying to figure out the basic principles behind it all.
So what are those challenges? What makes ecology such a gold mine for philosophy of science?
Well, for starters, ecological stuff often happens across multiple levels. You have individuals, you have populations, communities, whole biomes, the whole shebang, and it all plays out across different scales of space and time, too.
I see. So something that happens to one keystone species could end up impacting a whole ecosystem for decades.
Exactly. And that brings us to the second challenge, which is that getting good, reliable data in ecology is notoriously difficult. Ecologists are often dealing with open systems where you can't really control everything, and natural environments are, inherently variable.
That makes a ton of sense. It's a whole different ballgame from a physics experiment in a lab, right?
Right. And because of that, the third challenge pops up. The generalizations that ecologists can make tend to be very specific to the situation and might not apply in a different context. Something that's true in one ecosystem might not be true in another, even if they look super similar at first glance.
Wow. Okay. So generalizing is hard in ecology.
Right.
What else?
Okay, so the fourth challenge is that ecology has this interesting thing where it blends pure and applied research. You have scientists who are driven by just, the desire to understand ecological principles, and then you have others who are all about solving real-world problems.
So it's like the pursuit of knowledge for the sake of knowledge versus trying to solve concrete environmental problems like, invasive species or habitat restoration.
Exactly. And those different goals can sometimes lead to some tension in terms of the methods they use and the kind of knowledge they're after.
Right, totally makes sense.
And the fifth challenge, which is especially big in applied areas like conservation, is the fact that you've got these two sets of goals all tangled up together. You have the epistemic goals, which are all about gaining knowledge, and then you have non-epistemic goals, like ethical and societal values.
So it's like when you're dealing with something like biodiversity loss, you can't just look at the science. You also have to consider things like ethical obligations to protect species and how society values the resources that are at stake.
Exactly. It gets complicated really fast.
Okay, I'm starting to see why philosophy has so much to offer here. These aren't just like technical issues. They're raising some really deep questions about what it means to do science when you're studying something as complex as an ecosystem. Like, what actually counts as ecological knowledge? And what role should values play in shaping that knowledge, especially when you're trying to use it to make decisions that impact the real world?
You got it. And here's the thing, the philosophy of ecology is a pretty young field. It's still developing, but it has the potential to actually help ecological research by providing frameworks for, clarifying those core concepts, taking a hard look at the methods they're using, and figuring out how to tackle those philosophical challenges we just talked about.
So philosophers can actually contribute to the progress of ecological science itself.
That's amazing, a real partnership between disciplines.
It really is. And to help us navigate this landscape, the Stanford Encyclopedia entry breaks it down into two main areas. First, you have philosophical topics in ecology, which are basically all about the new concepts and debates that have come directly from studying these ecological systems.
Okay, I like that, philosophical questions that come from the science itself.
Right. And then you have philosophy of science and ecology, where those classic issues from philosophy of science get examined through the lens of ecology. And this often ends up revealing new aspects of those philosophical issues or even challenging them in new ways. I'm ready to dive in. Let's start with those philosophical topics in ecology. Where do we begin?
Well, we got to start with the basics, right? And that means asking, what are the units of ecological research? Traditionally, ecologists have focused on three main units: populations, which are groups of individuals from the same species.
Got it.
Then you have communities, which are all the different species that live and interact together in a certain area.
Okay, makes sense.
And then there are ecosystems, which basically include the community plus all the non-living stuff in their environment. Each of these units has led to specific research questions, methodologies, and even whole subfields within ecology.
So you have ecologists who specialize in populations, others who focus on communities, and others who study ecosystems. But are these divisions actually clear-cut in the real world? Like, are these units really distinct entities in nature, or is it more blurry than that?
That's where philosophy comes in. Those divisions are super useful for organizing research, but there are definitely debates about exactly how to define each unit and whether they're truly separate things in nature. Let's start with the ecosystem. At the most basic level, it's the organisms in a certain area, along with their physical environment, all interacting. But the real debate is about how those components are defined and the nature of their connections.
So how do ecologists approach the idea of an ecosystem? What are the main ways of thinking about it?
The entry talks about three main views. First, there's the Elton-Lindemann view, which sees ecosystems as complex systems, meaning they're more than just a bunch of parts thrown together. In this view, energy flows through this intricate web of organisms and abiotic factors, one thing eating another and so on.
So it's like a giant food web, but it also includes things like sunlight and nutrient cycles, right?
Exactly. Then you have H.T. Odum, and he had a more holistic system-level perspective. He was really interested in the overall energy flow between different levels. So you've got your producers, then your herbivores, then your carnivores, that kind of thing. And sometimes he kind of downplayed the importance of individual species and their specific interactions.
Interesting.
And finally, there's a more skeptical approach that questions whether ecosystems are really anything more than loosely connected groups of species. Or maybe they're just too diverse and open-ended to be a meaningful scientific category.
That skeptical view brings up some pretty fundamental questions. If an ecosystem isn't really a distinct entity with some internal coherence, how can we even talk about things like ecosystem health or ecosystem function? Do those ideas even make sense?
You hit the nail on the head. The question of whether ecosystems are real, cohesive, entities has huge implications for how we understand and use these evaluative concepts. And from a methodological standpoint, ecosystem ecology is often about measuring the flow of energy and matter between those different levels. They use complex models that are usually designed for specific ecosystems. But these models have been criticized for being too specific, so the results might not apply to other ecosystems. And they've also been criticized for overfitting the data, which basically means they might be incorporating random noise or spurious correlations into the model itself.
Right. So if your model is based on data from like one specific lake, it might not tell you much about how a forest ecosystem works. What about the next level up, the community? How do ecologists and philosophers approach defining that?
Oh, the community. They debate about what communities really are, and I mean groups of different species living and interacting together. This debate actually goes back further than the ecosystem debate. It's about this really fundamental question. Is a community just a random assortment of species that happen to be in the same place at the same time? Or is there something more to it, some emergent property that makes it more than just the sum of its parts?
Right. So is it just a collection of individuals,
Yeah.
or does it have its own unique identity as a whole?
Exactly. Some people think communities are just aggregates, that there's not much interdependence between the species. Others see them as wholes, where the interactions between species create a level of organization that makes the community a distinct thing. And historically, there was even a more radical view, championed by Frederick Clements, who said that communities were so tightly integrated that they basically function like one giant organism. He called it a superorganism.
A superorganism made up of all these different species. That's some serious interconnectedness.
I know, right? And while the superorganism idea isn't widely accepted today in its original form, the question of whether communities have enough internal structure and clear boundaries to be considered these meaningful wholes is still a hot topic.
Hmm.
Philosophers and historians of science have even gotten involved, looking at the history of the concept and the assumptions, both conceptual and sociological, that shaped how it developed. But the most common view today is that communities have some internal organization because of the way species interact, but they're not as tightly integrated and unified as a superorganism.
Okay, that makes sense. So if we think about a community in this way, how do ecologists go about studying it?
Community ecology is all about the interactions between populations. Competition for resources, predator-prey relationships, mutualism, parasitism, the whole network of direct and indirect effects between species that coexist in an area.
Wow, that's a lot of interactions to keep track of.
It is. And a lot of the core concepts in ecology came from studying communities, things like the niche, trophic levels, keystone species. Those are the species that have a disproportionately large impact on the whole community. And the idea of ecological engineering, where certain species actually modify their environment in significant ways. What's really interesting is that community ecology has a strong tradition of experiments, especially field experiments. Many of those foundational concepts came from classic experiments like Robert Payne's work on starfish in intertidal communities, showing how important these keystone predators are. Or G.F. Goss's really elegant lab experiments on competition between different species of paramecium. Mathematical models like the Lotka-Volterra equations, which describe predator-prey and competitive dynamics, are also super important in understanding community-level stuff.
So community ecology is all about those relationships between species, and they use a lot of experiments to test their hypotheses about those interactions. Now let's go one level down to the population. What are the philosophical issues there?
A population, which is usually defined as a group of individuals of the same species that are interbreeding and living in the same place at the same time, is generally considered a bit less controversial than communities or ecosystems when it comes to its ontological status. Most people agree that populations are real, identifiable things in the world.
So there's less debate about whether they actually exist as distinct entities.
Right. But philosophers of science still have some interesting things to say about populations, especially how the concept is used and understood across different areas of ecology and evolutionary biology. Roberta Milstein, for instance, has proposed something called the causal interactionist population concept, or CIPC for short. This defines a population as having at least two individuals of the same species that are interacting in ways that affect their survival or reproduction over a single generation.
So it's not just about being in the same place at the same time. It's about actually engaging in those essential life processes together, like competing for resources or reproducing.
Exactly. And Milstein also argues that populations should be considered individuals in a philosophical sense, which aligns with the broader idea that species themselves might be better understood as individuals rather than natural kinds or classes. Of course, this view has its critics. Some people say that the way ecologists and evolutionary biologists use the term population is different enough that the populations as individuals idea might make more sense in an evolutionary context. And others think we need a more pluralistic approach, meaning there might not be one single definition of population that works perfectly for every situation.
So it depends on the specific research question and the context you're working in. Now, from a methodological standpoint, how has population ecology developed over time?
Population ecology has been around for a while, and it was actually a turning point for ecology as a whole. It marked a shift towards more quantitative and theoretical methods. Ecologists started applying mathematical models borrowed from fields like demography and physics, and a lot of them saw this as a crucial step in making ecology a more rigorous and predictive science.
So bringing in that quantitative mathematical approach really helped to elevate ecology's status as a hard science.
Exactly. Research in population ecology usually focuses on things like population dynamics, which is how populations grow, decline, and fluctuate over time. They look at birth rates, death rates, density-dependent regulation, migration patterns, all that good stuff. The models used in population ecology tend to be simpler and more general than the ones used at the ecosystem level. They're trying to capture those basic principles that apply to a wide range of populations. But that generality can come at the cost of realism, because these models often leave out details that are specific to certain populations or environments. For instance, a model of competition based on how animals interact might not be very accurate when you're talking about plants, because things like light availability and nutrient uptake are so important for them.
That makes sense. A general model of population growth might not capture all the nuances of, say, a highly territorial animal species versus a plant that spreads its seeds with the wind. Now, the last of these traditional units, the individual organism, it seems almost too basic to be philosophically interesting, but is there more to it than meets the eye?
You know, it's funny. For a long time, the individual organism actually got less attention in ecology than those group level units. Most models and experiments were focused on populations or higher levels of organization, and they often treated individuals within a group as if they were all pretty much the same, like interchangeable parts.
So they were more interested in identifying broad patterns at the group level rather than getting into the nitty-gritty of individual variation.
Right. And there were some practical reasons for that. Averaging out the characteristics of many individuals can help reduce noise in the data and simplify those complex models so scientists can isolate more general patterns. But there's a growing movement within ecology that's saying, hey, those individual differences actually matter. Subdisciplines like behavioral ecology and physiological ecology have always focused on the individual, of course. But more broadly, some ecologists are arguing that the variation between individuals can be crucial for understanding what happens at the population level and even at the ecosystem level. For example, back in the 1970s, Joan Roughgarden argued that individual differences within a population could explain its niche width, which is the range of resources it can use effectively. And that niche width, in turn, affects how resilient and adaptable the population is.
So individual variation can actually have large-scale consequences.
Exactly. And the rise of individual-based models, IBMs, which ecologists actually borrowed from economics and social simulation, has also highlighted the importance of considering individuals. And even more recently, there's been this push to incorporate individual-level variation into models and experimental designs across many areas of ecology. This has led to some really cool insights, like how the dominant female meerkats in a group can actually influence the reproductive success of other females through physiological mechanisms.
Wow, so the social dynamics of meerkats can impact their reproductive physiology. That's a level of detail you'd miss if you were just looking at broad ecological patterns.
Exactly. It shows how those individual level interactions can have ripple effects that scale up to the population and even the community. But it's important to note that this focus on individuals in ecology is different from the whole philosophical debate about biological individuality, which is more about what actually makes something a biological individual in the context of evolution. For example, should a whole colony of ants be considered one individual? That sort of thing. The focus in ecology is more about the functional role that individual variation plays in ecological processes.
Okay, that's helpful to distinguish. We've talked about those different units that ecologists study. Now let's tackle another big philosophical topic in ecology, the niche. You mentioned this earlier, a central concept, but a tough one to pin down.
It really is. The niche is like this core concept in ecological theory, almost iconic. But it's also notoriously difficult to define in a way that everyone agrees on. Lots of influential ecologists, people like Joseph Grinnell, Charles Elton, G.E. Hutchinson, and Robert MacArthur, they've all come up with their own definitions of the niche. And while there's some overlap, they also diverge in some pretty important ways.
So it's one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot, but it can mean slightly different things depending on who's using it and what they're studying.
Exactly. The entry highlights three main ways that the niche has been conceptualized. First, you have the Grinnellian niche. This basically equates the niche with the habitat a species occupies. So all those environmental conditions, both biotic living things and abiotic non-living things that are present in that particular area.
So all those factors that determine where a species can survive and thrive.
Right. And a key principle associated with this view is that each fundamental niche can only be occupied by one species at a time. This is the principle of competitive exclusion, which we'll come back to later. The idea is that new niches can emerge as habitats change, and then those vacant niches can be filled by species that adapt to those new conditions. This concept is really useful for explaining why species have the specific traits they do. They've evolved to fit into that particular habitat niche.
So the niche is like a specific address in the environment, and only one species can live at that address at a time, kind of like a no vacancy sign.
That's a great analogy. Then you have Elton's functional niche. Elton shifted the focus away from the habitat itself and towards the role that an organism plays in its ecological community. He called it its occupation in the biotic environment, meaning its relationships with other species through things like feeding, predation, decomposition, all those kinds of interactions. He even said that when an ecologist sees a badger, they should think about its function in the community, just like you'd think about the role of, say, a vicar in a town. This functional perspective also allows for the idea of vacant functional roles in a community that could be filled by newcomers.
Okay, so Grinnell is all about where a species lives, and Elton is more about what a species does within its community.
You got it. And then you have Hutchinson, who came up with this idea of the niche as an abstract, n-dimensional hyperspace. Imagine every environmental factor that affects a species' ability to survive and reproduce, things like temperature, food availability, all that as an axis in a multidimensional space.
Okay, I'm trying to picture this multidimensional space.
I know, it's a lot. The total theoretical space where a species could persist indefinitely is its fundamental niche. But because of interactions with other species, like competition, the actual space it occupies, its realized niche, is usually smaller than its fundamental niche.
So there's the theoretical space where it could live, and then the reality of where it actually ends up living, which is shaped by all those interactions with other species.
Precisely. It's much more abstract, but it gave ecologists a way to think about niches mathematically and see how they might overlap or be different between species. This led to more quantitative ways of studying community structure. But despite its importance in ecology, the niche concept has had its fair share of criticism.
Okay, bring on the criticisms. What are some of the arguments against the niche?
One of the main things the niche concept has been used for is to explain how ecological communities are organized. This is where the principle of competitive exclusion, CEP, comes in. It basically says that two species that have exactly the same niche can't coexist forever in a stable environment. One of them will inevitably outcompete the other and drive it out.
So it's like two businesses trying to occupy the same storefront. One of them will eventually go out of business.
Yeah, kind of like that. For a lot of ecologists, this principle and the broader competition theory behind it are fundamental to ecology. They provide this connection to evolutionary biology by explaining not only how communities are structured, but also the evolutionary processes that shape that structure.
That's a pretty powerful idea. That competition for resources shapes both the present-day composition of communities and how species evolve over time. So what are the limitations or challenges associated with this view?
Well, some ecologists argue that this whole niche competition framework, even though it seems intuitive, isn't always enough to explain the patterns we see in real-world ecological communities. The competitive exclusion principle itself has been criticized for being really hard to test in the field, so it's not always that useful for making predictions or guiding research. And then came Stephen Hubble, who threw a real wrench into things with his neutral theory of community structure. Hubble basically said that for a lot of species that are similar in terms of what they eat and their overall ecological role, their functional differences might not actually matter that much when it comes to competition. He said that community structure and how many individuals there are of each species are mainly driven by random events, things like birth, death, and dispersal, as well as speciation. And niche differences, according to him, don't play such a big role in determining which species are successful.
So it's less about this deterministic battle for specific resources and more about a kind of ecological lottery where chance plays a bigger role.
That's the gist of it. And neutral theory has been super controversial in ecology. People are still debating exactly how it relates to traditional niche-based explanations. Some see them as fundamentally different ways of explaining community structure, while others think neutral theory is useful as a kind of baseline, a null hypothesis against which you can test the importance of niche differences. And there have been attempts to bring those two views together into more integrated theories.
It's fascinating how you have these seemingly opposing ideas in ecology. Those deterministic, niche-based explanations on the one hand, and then those more random neutral explanations on the other. It's like a battle between order and chaos in the ecological world.
It really is. And then there's James Justice, a philosopher of science, who has a more radical critique of the niche concept itself. He argues that maybe the whole concept is unnecessary. He says that none of the different definitions of the niche have been consistently good at explaining or predicting how communities are structured and how they work in real ecosystems. He also argues that attempts to combine those different niche concepts into one unified definition have ended up with definitions that are too vague and abstract. They lack those specific causal details that you need to really capture those ecological interactions.
So Justice is saying that despite its long history and how important people think it is, the niche concept might not actually be doing the heavy lifting we expect it to do when it comes to explaining things. That's a pretty bold statement.
It is, and it shows how even those seemingly fundamental concepts in ecology are still being scrutinized and debated by philosophers. Now, let's move on to another hot topic in the philosophy of ecology, one that has some really important practical and ethical dimensions: biological invasions.
This is definitely a topic that's been making headlines, and it's one that people have strong feelings about. What are some of the key philosophical issues that arise from the study of biological invasions?
Well, right off the bat, there's the problem of defining what actually is a biological invader. The ecological literature is full of different terms: invasive species, alien species, exotic species, non-native species, and so on. And each term often comes with its own assumptions and judgments about the species in question. This lack of a consistent and universally accepted definition can make it really difficult to communicate clearly and to come up with effective management strategies.
Right, so the language we use can shape how we think about these species and the actions we take. So what are some of the specific challenges with defining these terms?
For instance, how do we determine a species' native range? Many species have naturally expanded their ranges over time, or they've been introduced by humans so long ago that it's hard to say where they originally came from. And then there's the question of what counts as being widespread and causing ecological harm. Some introduced species might establish themselves and spread in a new environment, but they don't seem to have much of a negative impact on the native ecosystem. Should we call those invasive? On the other hand, what about species that have become so integrated into a new ecosystem over time that removing them might actually do more harm than good?
So it's not always clear-cut whether a species should be considered invasive or not. The lines can get blurry.
Exactly. And all of this has led to a pretty heated debate among invasion biologists and even some philosophers of science about whether the language we use, especially terms like alien or invasive, is inherently biased against non-native species, and whether that bias influences research, funding decisions, and even public perception. One side of this debate argues that the threat posed by invasive species is often exaggerated. They point out that relatively few extinctions can be directly blamed on biological invasions, and in some cases, they argue, introduced species can actually have positive effects, like helping to stabilize disturbed ecosystems or even increasing local biodiversity. They're also concerned about the costs and potential ecological damage caused by large-scale efforts to eradicate invasive species, which they argue are sometimes unnecessary.
So they're advocating for a more nuanced perspective, one that doesn't automatically label all non-native species as bad guys.
Right. But on the other side, you have people who are adamant that invasive species are a serious problem. They point to tons of examples, especially on islands, where introduced predators, competitors, or pathogens have really devastated native species and disrupted important ecological processes. They also argue that even introductions that seem harmless now could become major problems in the future, especially as climate change continues to alter ecosystems. Some people in this camp even accuse those who downplay the negative effects of invasives of engaging in a kind of invasive species denialism, saying that they're ignoring the potential for serious and irreversible damage.
Wow, so it's a pretty polarized debate with high stakes for both science and society. What about the research on why some introduced species become invasive while others don't? What are the main theories there?
That's another big area of research in invasion biology, and it has its own history and controversies. Generally, there have been two main approaches to explaining the causes of invasions, each with its own methods and development over time. The first one, which often comes from population ecology, focuses on the specific traits of the invading species itself. The idea here is that some species just have a set of characteristics that make them pre-adapted for success in new environments. These could be physiological traits, behaviors, or things about their life cycle that allow them to establish themselves, reproduce, and spread quickly, often outcompeting native species in the process. For example, studies on invasive pine trees from the genus Pinus have found that traits like small seed size, short generation times, and fast growth rates are important factors in their success. The argument is that these traits give them a leg up in new environments, allowing them to grow faster and disperse more efficiently.
So they come preloaded with these biological advantages that allow them to thrive in new territories. What about the other approach?
The second big tradition focuses on the characteristics of the community or ecosystem that's being invaded. The idea here is that some ecosystems are simply more vulnerable to invasion than others. One early hypothesis was that ecosystems with high biodiversity would be more resistant to invasion because all the niches would already be filled. But that idea has been refined over time. Now, there are more nuanced theories that focus on things like resource availability. For example, the resource availability theory suggests that communities with lots of unused resources are more vulnerable to invasion because the invaders can easily exploit those resources without much competition from the natives.
So the first approach is all about the invader, and the second one is about the vulnerability of the ecosystem being invaded. Have those two approaches been combined into a more unified theory?
People have tried to bring those two perspectives together, but we still don't have a single, widely accepted theory that can accurately predict which introductions will lead to invasions and what the impacts will be. This lack of a unified theory worries some invasion biologists because they think it makes it harder to develop effective prediction and management tools. But there's another view that says maybe a single overarching theory is just not possible because biological invasions are so complex and context dependent. Each invasion involves a unique species interacting with a specific environment in a particular way, so maybe there are just too many idiosyncratic factors involved to be captured by a simple set of rules.
Sounds like with biological invasions, you're dealing with a situation where both the traits of the invader and the specific characteristics of the ecosystem play important roles, and those roles often interact in complex ways. That makes it really difficult to come up with broad generalizations.
You got it. And that brings us to the last philosophical topic in ecology on our list, conservation. This is definitely an area where ecological science and ethical and societal values are really closely intertwined.
Absolutely. At its core, conservation is about protecting the parts of the natural world that we think are important or valuable, either ecologically or for other reasons. But is it considered a separate field from pure ecology, or is it more like a subfield within ecology?
That's a good question, and there's not really a clear-cut answer. It can be seen as either a subdiscipline within ecology or as its own distinct field. And sometimes the goals and research priorities in conservation are different from those in more theoretical knowledge-driven ecology. One set of philosophical issues that comes up a lot in conservation is how we define the very ideal of conservation. What are we ultimately trying to achieve with our conservation efforts? And this leads to those big fundamental debates about how we understand nature and wilderness.
So, like, what does it even mean for something to be natural or wild?
Exactly. For example, are humans part of nature, or are we somehow separate? What makes a habitat truly wild? Our answers to these questions can have a huge impact on the kinds of conservation strategies we choose and how we justify them ethically.
Right, so if you think the humans are separate from nature, you might be more inclined to protect pristine areas from any human interference. But if you see humans as part of the natural world, you might.